welcome to Sense and Sensibility, the Inflation Guy podcast. I am Michael Ashton. I am the Inflation Guy, and I am your host. Today on the podcast, we had a watershed event happen this week. A socialist was nominated by the Democratic Party as their candidate for New York City mayor. Whether or not he wins or loses in the actual general mayoral election, it's amazing to me that a major party nominated a socialist at all, and not even a touchy-feely socialist like Bernie Sanders, but a real socialist proposing real socialist kinds of things. So I thought it would be useful to talk about inflation in the context of socialism. But before we get to that, a word from our sponsors. This episode of Sense and Sensibility is sponsored by Simplify ETFs, a fast-growing manager of liquid alternative ETFs. Simplify is bringing Wall Street to Main Street by providing access to institutional strategies perfect for diversifying your equity and bond portfolios previously only available to big institutions and the ultra-rich. Check out their website at simplify.us. You can find their entire lineup of ETFs at simplify.us/ETFs. Thank you, Simplify. And before I get to the actual meat of the content, I also want to take a moment to report back from Monetarium 2. Monetarium is a conference, and as the website says, and you can see the link in the show notes, Monetarium is a gathering for stability geeks interested in making better money. I was invited to go to Monetarium and speak about our inflation-linked coin, USDI, and my speech was very well received, as I knew it would be when I heard about the conference and I heard about what they were all about, and I knew they'd love what we were doing. But I have to say the entire conference was it was well run, and it was utterly fascinating. Every session, usually you go to these conferences and you go to, a few sessions and then you go back to your room and sleep for a little bit and you go to another couple sessions that are interesting and, you go, hobnob and kibitz and meet people. But I went to every session that I could get to. It was just, everything was just so fascinating. And everyone there thinks about inflation and how to, well, for lack of a better term, how to defend your money. And so I felt a real simpatico with these folks and thoroughly enjoyed myself. I hope they invite me back to speak again next year. I'll already say yes. Anyway, I highly recommend the conference. And I have to also say this, having been to this conference, but this is my first crypto conference that I've been to. In 35 years that I've spent in TradFi, I will testify that the openness to new ideas is just amazingly bad. And I guess I sort of knew that, but really going to this conference sort of laid the contrast so bare. I mean, at least in the last 20 years, Wall Street as a whole is anti-innovation, anti-small firm. The best way to become a big asset manager is to start as a big asset manager. Going from being a small asset manager to a big asset manager is like almost impossible. But the crypto folks are totally the opposite. Some total crazy person can get up there. Not that there were a lot of crazy people at this conference, but there always are, right? And crypto is a place where crazy people can have their day. But the craziest idea, being proposed by somebody asking a question or leading a session or whatever, they're scrutinized by the people there for what those ideas are. Because even if the idea is crazy, there might be a useful kernel in there. Whereas on Wall Street, if you start off and 2 minutes in, people think you're crazy, you're done. I mean, it's over. And not at all true. I mean, everybody was respectful and listened to whatever the crazy idea was with the utmost respect. And because that's what crypto is. Projects start and they die and they morph and they pivot all the time. It was just so refreshing. Anyway, I really liked it. Now, speaking of crazy, so the Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani won the Democrat mayoral primary on Tuesday. For those of you who aren't in the U.S., the way that many elections typically work in the U.S., This means that he just won the right to run against candidates from other parties in the general election. Typically, the primaries pick the Republican and the Democrat, and those two face off, and there's an occasional independent thrown into the mix for spice and to make it, not just two parties, but it's generally those two parties. For a socialist to win a major national seat is extremely rare in the U.S., although it does happen in smaller races. I mean, you get the occasional senator like Bernie Sanders and the occasional congresswoman like AOC. AOC is, for all intents and purposes, a socialist, whatever she calls herself. And smaller races, local races, you'll get somebody who's effectively a socialist who wins and maybe even who calls themselves socialists. But it's still rare. It's very rare compared to the mainstream parties, if you will. Same with the libertarians. Libertarians almost never win anything, certainly at the national level, but they'll win local elections. Most of these politicians can't do a whole lot of damage. Bernie Sanders can't do a whole lot of damage in his current role because there are checks and balances, and one senator can't just do, crazy things all by himself. He's got to get, 49 other senators to agree, and it's also got to pass the lower chamber, and it's also got to be signed by the president. So, Bernie can't just go and, propose nationalizing, Iowa because, it wouldn't pass, right? So, so they can't do a lot of damage. And it is useful to the body politic in general, having a shrill, crazy voice on the backbench. It helps keep everybody in line, that there's some person, shouting crazy stuff back there because it just keeps you from being, too crazy yourself. But the mayor of New York City, on the other hand, wields a lot of power that doesn't have a whole lot of checks and balances on a lot of that power. It's not completely unchecked, but the checks are pretty weak. Okay. So let's talk about what Mamdani's platform is, the things that he has actually proposed. Like a lot of times you'll propose less crazy things to get elected, and then you'll try to do crazier things when you get elected, right? So his platform includes, increasing taxes on people making more than $1 million a year. Okay, that's not particularly socialist, whatever. But he has also said that he's very concerned about making life in the city more affordable. So he'd freeze rents on rent stabilized apartments like permanently. He would invest $70 billion, which he'd have to borrow, in publicly subsidized housing, 200,000 units over 10 years. I don't know where you're going to put them in New York City, but 200,000 units. He would provide free bus service to everybody and open government-owned grocery stores and give free child care for every New Yorker between the ages of 6 weeks and 5 years. Free child care. So his words about the grocery store thing, because that's what people often sort of scratch their head and say, what do you mean by free grocery stores? He doesn't mean the food would be free. In his words from his campaign website, we'd create a network of city-owned grocery stores focused on keeping prices low, not making a profit. Without having to pay rent or property taxes, they will reduce overhead and pass on savings to shoppers. Okay, so first things first, if you're going to be making a profit, groceries is not what you go into. Okay, so margins on grocery stores are not. This is why it's always amazing to me when people talk about price gouging in the grocery store arena. It is a highly competitive. It's not pure competition, but it's pretty damn close to pure competition. So the margins in groceries are very low and under a lot of pressure. Now, can you lower prices to people if you don't have to pay rent? Sure. If you lower the overall overhead, then in principle anyway, you can, that savings you can pass on to customers. Now, I don't really know how you get away with paying no rent. That's a cost to somebody, right? Are you going to seize the existing grocery stores or seize the buildings that you're going to turn into grocery stores? I don't know. But but somebody somewhere is getting ripped off. I don't know who it is, but somewhere, if you're not going to pay, rent, that somebody's getting ripped off. You can give them property tax exemption. That happens all the time for different industries, but they're not paying rent does makes you scratch your head. And we'll get into later about some of the basic problems with socialism, but that profit motive, as slim as it is in groceries, does turn out to be fairly important in some ways. Among other things, if you have a profit motive, then you are more likely to want to sell things that customers want to buy. Remember a few years ago, Mayor Bloomberg proposed, the big gulp tax that basically stores weren't going to be allowed to sell, really large sodas, and strictly socialism, right? So what happens with the grocery store when it's being run by the city and the city decides that, soda is bad for you, and so they don't sell soda anymore. Okay, so they're not motivated by profit, because if they were motivated by profit, they'd make sure they sold plenty of Coca-Cola, because everybody loves Coca-Cola. But they're motivated by other things other than profit. Anyway, I'll get to that in a second. I want to mention another campaign promise, which is, to really, fight against bad landlords, slumlords. And this sounds really good, on the surface, right? I mean, landlords who, refuse to make repairs and to, let their buildings fall into disrepair. A lot of times that's because they're rent-controlled apartments, and so they can't make any money if they're not making repairs. Or if they're out there making repairs and making a really, really fancy place they can't charge money on. But it's what happens next here. So there's already like anti-slumlord rules in New York, right? So you can't just be a slumlord without, somebody from the government coming and fining you. But if a landlord refuses to make a repair, and again, this is from his website, the city will do it, make the repair, and send them the bill. Okay. And in the most extreme cases, when an owner demonstrates consistent neglect for their tenants, not really sure how that's defined, the city will decisively step in and take control of their properties. Okay, so the city will seize control of your property if you are a landlord, and you're demonstrating neglect for your tenants. Now, I don't know what that means. Does it demonstrate neglect for your tenants if you don't dedicate 20% of each floor to a big open space where people can play Scrabble? Does it demonstrate consistent neglect for your tenants if you charge them, utilities? I don't know. I suspect that it will be defined in such a way that the city will be able to fairly regularly, decisively step in and take control of the properties. But just to be clear, if the city is stepping in to take control of properties, that's full-blown central planning, central ownership, power vested in the top sort of socialism. And again, this is the official platform. Now, so it's amazing the guy won, okay? It's not quite as amazing as it sounds, because in New York now they have what's known as ranked choice voting. Now, the way that works is everyone goes out and votes, and you vote a list. And first we'll just count up all the top choices from everyone's list. And if if a candidate gets more than 50%, then they win. And it's just like a regular election where you had, your top choice was who you voted for, and then that person wins. If after that first ballot, someone doesn't have 50%, then you go and you eliminate the worst performing candidate, seventh place, and you look at all those ballots and you take whoever was second place for all of those voters, and you take those second place votes and you add them to the other candidates, and which of course pushes everyone's share up a little bit, and now you see if you have someone who's at 50%. And if you don't, then you go to the next round. Eventually someone has more than 50%. So you can sort of some people like ranked choice voting, and there are some things that are appealing about it. Like every voting system, you can show that there are configurations of the vote that end up with absurd outcomes, like people winning who everybody had at second place on their ballot, but nobody had first place on their ballot, right? So you can just, look, let me explain that real quick. So you've got 3 candidates, all right? Or 20 candidates. You have 20 candidates. And the first 2 candidates, first ballot, they get 40%, 40%. Everyone else gets a smattering of other votes. And so you eliminate the person at the bottom, and it turns out that the person who was second place on all those ballots was, Fred. And so now Fred moves up. And then still no one has 50%. And so you go to eliminate the next guy. And it turns out everyone there had Fred as their second place. And so on and so forth. And it turns out that Fred, even though nobody wanted Fred to win, he wasn't anyone's first choice, he ends up winning the election. So you can sort of demonstrate that you can get absurdities. But it turns out, by the way, you can get absurdities from any sort of election. There is no voting system that will always give you a logical outcome. And in fact, there's a whole theory of voting systems that's really fascinating reading. Anyhow, but it's a weird system. And so now that's not really the point here, though, the ranked choice voting. But one of the reasons that Mamdani won was that he was running against Andrew Cuomo, which everyone kind of thought Cuomo, it's New York, so Cuomo was going to win because Cuomo's win in New York, except that he didn't. Cuomo has enough baggage from COVID and some sexual, let's just say, picadillos, to be generous, that people didn't like him enough to put him as their first choice. And so enough people put Mamdani as their first choice that he, in the second or third ballot, ended up winning. So Cuomo's kind of out unless he runs as an independent. But in the general election, it will be Mamdani versus the current mayor, Eric Adams, who's running as an independent. I mean, most people don't like Eric Adams very much, but maybe they'll like him more than a socialist. And the Republican candidate is Curtis Sliwa, who to New Yorkers has a name they recognize because in 1979 he founded the Guardian Angels, back when the streets of New York were crazy and violent and dangerous. The Guardian Angels were a nonprofit where volunteers would basically go around wearing these red berets and kind of police where where there weren't enough police, they would kind of be the police and just sort of make sure that everyone was safe, basically, whatever. But they patrolled subways and things like that. Anyway, Republicans occasionally win New York City mayor. I don't know if Sliwa's got a chance of doing that. The city has been turning bluer since the Giuliani days. In a 3-way contest, who knows? But it's just remarkable that here we are. And again, I'm not here to predict who's going to win the election, but a socialist has a chance of winning the election, and not a really bad chance of winning the election. So let's look at socialism and inflation. If we really are in a world where we could actually get a socialist outcome, a socialist system actually be implemented in the largest city in North America. Socialism destroys productivity. It doesn't much care about productivity. When the owner of the establishment is the government, efficiency is just not a major goal, right? So, socialism is basically described as kind of, government ownership of the means of production. And so if you doubt me that, government isn't necessarily a major goal, when the government's in charge and efficiency isn't a major goal, go visit a department of motor vehicles, or go try to get a passport or something if you think I'm kidding. It is a disastrously poorly designed system, extremely slow, very unmotivated people trying to help you, and that's your system when the government runs it. The Postal Service, Our mailman where I live just takes days off. I mean, he just decides he's not going to deliver on Friday, and we just don't get any mail on Friday because he just didn't feel like delivering mail on Friday. Happens right before long weekends quite a bit. Just decides to take the day off. Anyway, government system doesn't work very well. So, what does that mean? Well, growth, overall economic growth, is productivity growth plus population growth. That's just an identity, right? So if GDP growth is total output growth, there's two ways to grow total output. One is you get more people producing stuff, or two, those people produce more stuff themselves. Each one does, or some combination of the two. So if you destroy productivity growth, then overall economic growth suffers, unless for some reason people have lots more babies under socialism, and so that counterbalances. But assuming that they don't just have lots more babies because they're socialists and all of a sudden they want to have babies, when you destroy productivity growth, economic growth suffers. And by the same math, then, GDP per person grows more slowly, which means that's the standard of living. GDP per person is kind of the standard of living. And so that grows more slowly as well. Now, if you want to be fair, that might not be undesirable if another outcome to implementing socialism is a much more equal distribution of wealth, so that some people, the people at the bottom, do see their standard of living improve faster than GDP per capita because, the pie is being cut more in their favor at the expense of the wealthy. Okay, and so that's the offer of socialism, is that we're going to be in charge and we're going to make sure that we cut the pie more fairly for everybody. And that's the reason that sort of system is appealing to a lot of people, because they're going to see their pie increase. And so in the early stages, one of the things that Mamdani has said he's going to do is he's going to jack up the minimum wage, and everyone making minimum wage in New York City is going to be really, really happy about that, and their lives are going to get better. Other people's lives will get worse, but you can certainly imagine that when you're first cutting the pie differently and you're making the small slices larger, those people are going to be really happy with how it works. Now, it can't last forever because eventually the cow runs out of milk. If you're going to, even if the cow doesn't, just to mix metaphors, even if the cow doesn't flee altogether, the cow that you're milking to give it to all these people, you're giving everyone a glass of milk that you're milking from the cow. That works great if you're the one getting the milk. Doesn't work so great if you're the cow. Eventually the cow runs out of milk, and then those people stop getting kind of their free milk. But for a while, that can make socialism look better for the average citizen. But the long-term benefit of growing the pie faster eventually swamps any benefit of slicing the pie more evenly. Okay. Again, sort of think year one, you take the pie and you make all the slices even. And then from then on, the pie grows slowly. Well, eventually, the size of all those pieces will be smaller because the pie is lots smaller than if you had kept the relative sizes of the slices the same but grew the pie much, much faster, right? Yes, when the pie is growing faster, more of those gains accrue to the wealthy, but some of the gains accrue to those less wealthy. And at some point, unless you're continually making those smaller slices smaller and smaller, again, that's part of the socialist argument, is that they say that is what's happening. Eventually, the capitalist system makes everybody better off. But in the early stages, what's very appealing is that today, tomorrow, when the socialists take over, me at the bottom, my lot is going to get better. Now, let's turn to inflation. If underlying growth is slower, then a monetarist is going to say that unless the monetary body, the central bank, also grows money growth concomitantly lower, then such a society also ends up with more inflation, because MV equals PQ. And if Q, that's GDP, if it's growing more slowly and MV is growing at the same rate, then P's got to go up, right? to make that equivalence work. I should note that New York City does not control its money supply. That is controlled by the Fed. So I assert that in socialist economies, inflation is higher. This may seem to you, dear listener, as somewhat at odds with our mental image of socialist countries. If you just in your head think socialist country and think of what comes up in your head, and you probably imagine people in small rent-controlled apartments have to wait a long time for a plumber. In my picture, they're living in relative squalor. Okay, socialist countries do end up leaving, historically, many people in poverty, because it turns out the people at the top still take their cut. It's just that it's a smaller number of people at the top, and they're the people who are just trying to work for you. But so our image is that you have lots of people in poverty. So how is that consistent with inflation, right? And the problem is that while socialism clearly leads to inflation for the reasons that I just stated, it doesn't necessarily show up as measured inflation. That is, it's not necessarily that prices are going up all the time. We don't necessarily have socialist economies. In fact, it's fairly unusual to have socialist economies with spiraling price inflation, because that's not allowed. The prices are fixed. So then how do you get inflation? Well, this is when we go back to how we construct an inflation index. If you're getting less for the same amount of money, that's inflation. That's in the CPI, that shows up as a quality adjustment. If you were getting a 20-ounce box of Cheerios, now you're getting a 16-ounce box of Cheerios for the same price, then that's inflation. If you were getting a 20-ounce box of Cheerios and now they've replaced some of the oats in the Cheerios with sawdust, that's inflation. And that's what happens in socialist societies when prices are fixed. If I fix the price of beans, then inflation shows up as shortages and misallocations and diminishing quality. Think back to, and this was, by the way, this was a great example of what happens in a socialist economy, is what happened in the early days of COVID, when everybody started getting airdropped a lot of money, and so we should have seen a lot of inflation. But in 2020, we didn't see a lot of price inflation. Instead, what we saw was empty shelves. And I actually had a podcast at the time saying that shortages are unmeasured inflation. I should put a link to that in the show notes as well. Shortages are unmeasured inflation. And so that's what happens in socialist societies, is you get these misallocations, these shortages, and the problem, well, that's already a problem. So there's a problem and a problem and a problem and a problem. They all lead to additional problems. But from the standpoint of an investor and somebody who wants you to defend your money, how do we defend against that? And one of the problems with defending against that is that it's if you get that kind of inflation that doesn't show up in the measured price indices, if it's a change in quality, it will, assuming that the labor statistical agency is being fair. A change in quality will show up in inflation, but if it's just not available at the price that it's quoted, that doesn't show up as inflation. And so what that means is that if you are buying an inflation-linked bond and suddenly nothing is available, but stated inflation is 2%, then that's what you get, 2%. Even though there's actual inflation going on under the system, everything's going to the black market, prices are going up crazily, your standard of living is clearly going down, but your inflation-linked bond in that circumstance just didn't do a good job of hedging. That is the circumstance where your non-explicit inflation hedges come in. Your gold, silver, physical commodities, real estate to some extent, those sorts of things. It's in that circumstance where, yes, there's more price risk to those things. But if you're going to put together a portfolio that's inflation resistant, inflation-linked bonds are a great way to start. But things like gold and, and some other things, I won't necessarily say crypto, because I don't think most unbacked crypto is really a good inflation hedge. But it's in that kind of environment that starts to have some validity. And that seems like a good place to stop for now. So please like, subscribe, refer others to this podcast. You can contact me at inflationguy@enduringinvestments.com. Subscribe for free to the blog at inflationguy.blog. Follow me on X at inflation_guy. You can also go to our website, usdicoin.com, to find out about that crypto project. Visit Enduring Investments if you need help with diagnosing and treating the inflation problem. And most importantly, defend your money. And if inflation is coming for you, remember, you know a guy.